Since students were having difficulty drawing these patterns in their sketchbooks, I decided to start using graph paper because graph paper is the best way for them to understand how grids and patterns work. These squares on this grid are 1 inch high. On some of them we're going to cut them in half. And we're not using rulers to cut these in half, we're doing everything visually. Now for our purposes, at least as far as this assignment goes, instead of using the paper horizontally, we're going to use it vertically. As is the case for everything we do in here, please put your name at the top. What period number you have art or multimedia design. Your shelf number, which is going to be 1 through 36. I just use 48 because we don't have a shelf 48, and that's one of my favorite numbers. And then you're also going to put what grade you're in. Could be 8, could be 7, could be 6. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this assignment before we started using the grids, initially I wanted your first 4 drawings to be about 1.5 inches tall. Now on me, that goes from the tip of my finger down to my knuckles. Understanding that students have different size hands, we're going to use the graph paper instead. I'm going to draw the first 4 shapes at the same time because these first 4 shapes have the same attributes. Excuse me. Another word for attributes would be features. So the first shape looks like a U. Also, I had students do these with pencil, but I'm doing them in ink so that it shows up better on this camera. The second one is a V. And the best way to do a V on the graph paper is to do a dot in the center of this area and then do the lines back up like this. The third shape looks like a bracket tilted on its side. So again, I'm going to start in the middle. I'm going to do a bracket shape like this, and then I'm going to extend these up to the top of the page. Now on this next shape, a student made a mistake drawing this one, but their mistake was so cool I decided to keep it and just teach one more pattern based on what that student did, which in this case was to square off that leaf shape. So far you can't tell that they have the same attributes, but one of the first attributes was that they're the same height. The second one was we're duplicating the shape inside each one of these shapes. And then we're going to duplicate it again. The next attribute that's the same on these is that the very inside shape has a line bisecting it from top to bottom. And then we're going to skip a line and draw a line down here. So even though the shapes are different, the attributes are the same. I'm going to zoom in so you can see the details. I'm also going to give you some vocabulary words. The key for this particular assignment, number 1, is consistency. The attributes of these are consistent. They're all about the same width. They're all about the same height. When you're taking one of these and multiplying it or duplicating it on the page, you want them to be consistent. The second one is control. How well you control your pencil or pen while you're drawing. The third one has to do with control, as well as consistency, and this one is precision. How precise are you in replicating or duplicating these images, patterns? And the fourth one is something I talk about all the time, and that is craftsmanship. I define craftsmanship as the care that you take while you're doing your artwork to be consistent, to be in control with precision. It doesn't have only to do with the drawing, though. It also has to do with how well you take care of your paper. If you're drawing with a pencil, I oftentimes will suggest taking another piece of paper and putting your hand down on it like this, so that you don't get pencil marks all over the side of your hand and drag it across or smudge your drawing. So on these three, the pattern is the same in that they're straight lines and they look like veins on a leaf. Already swept.
Huh?
He swept and mopped.
Oh, again, okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thank Sergio. So again, it's kind of an upside down V shape. And you can either do these like this, one line at a time, so that you can get more precise with your placement. Or you can play around with it as you're drawing. If you get tired of doing it this way, you can do it this way. The next part that's the same on these three is that these lines, I'm going to skip this line here in the middle, and then these lines continue on the outside. And again, these are diagonal. It almost looks as though these lines go underneath this one. And you can just continue it all the way around. One thing you need to be careful of, I've been drawing for a very long time, and even though I made a mistake right there and went over the line, for the most part, I'm pretty accurate in my placement of my lines. You want to start and stop on a line so that it's very precise. What happens is the quicker you go, the less accurate you sometimes are, and you might go over the line. So try and keep them as precise and in control as possible. I'm going to skip over this one for right now because the lines on the veins are different on that one. And I'll show you what I mean on that in just a minute. So this was a case where a student did the pattern wrong, but after I showed them how to do it the correct way, I kept this one and added it to my arsenal of designs. So how this one differs from the other three is instead of straight lines in here, and I taught this in class, but students either didn't hear me or weren't listening or ignored my instruction, and that is that on this one, the shapes on the inside are M-shaped. Technically, it still has the same attributes because it has these veins on the inside shape. But since they're not straight, like the other ones are, it's similar but different. I'm also going to curve the lines around the edge here. This one, more than the other ones, looks more like a regular leaf, even though the other ones could be considered stylized leaves. So each one of these first four are units that you would replicate over and over again so that you end up with something like this. These were done in sketchbooks last week, and I taught and told them that I wanted them to be a certain height, and you can see mine are even a little smaller on the original one. They were closer to an inch. If I can move it on the grid, you can see that it's about an inch tall on these two parts of the grid. But as much as possible, trying to keep them consistent in width and height and the attributes. So you go from the curved ones to the triangular shaped ones to the ones that look like leaves. And then down here we did the ones that were more angular leaves. Again, just a different pattern. All of these little lines that fill in all those areas are called hatches. So that would be one of our vocabulary words. These are all hatches or hatch marks. You might have heard the term crosshatch. And just like it sounds, when you crosshatch, you do lines one way and then you cross them this way. Because inside of a shape, this one looks like a different tone than that one. I'll try to make these both diamond shaped. Now this particular hatching pattern can also be horizontal and vertical. So you can do a series of horizontal lines first and then do a series of vertical lines. This one is twice as dense as that one, so it looks a little darker. If you want to go darker still, you would just do the same hatch marks, cross-hatch them, and then use the diagonal patterns also. So if this were on a scale, this would be the darkest of the three. And depending on how far apart the lines are, you could even do multiples over and over like this with the lines further apart. So for instance, if I wanted to do it with the same pattern, but a little bit lighter, I could use half as many lines going this way, and half as many lines going this way. And it's the same pattern, but because the lines are farther apart, the area looks lighter on the page. So those are just different cross-hatching techniques, and we're going to use all of these. The reason we're doing it this way instead of the sample sheet, you can see on the sample sheet, for instance, some of the patterns look like checkerboards. We're not going to do solids like this, even though that is part of this particular style of drawing. Anytime we have a solid, like this area in here, we're going to do cross-hatching instead. And the reason being is that these are intended to be coloring book pages eventually. So moving on to the next pattern. The next pattern that we did was, again, very difficult to do for some students because we didn't have a grid. But what I'm going to do on the next pattern, which is a very common pattern, is I'm going to cut these lines in half. So I'm going to go ahead and use this blank space over here. And I'm going to draw some grid lines. These are now half-inch grid lines. And the way this unit of pattern looks is that there is a square at the bottom that's 1/4 or 1/4 of the size of the whole square. So I'm starting at about halfway on the bottom and going about halfway side to side. This is the first pattern that we'll do that looks to be three-dimensional. Because from this corner, we're going to draw a diagonal line down to the corner of the small one. And here's again where precision comes into play. You want to get them as close as possible. This may need or necessitate you to slow down. So, inside these smaller squares, we're going to do hatch marks going diagonal this way. And now it's going to start to look a little more three-dimensional, simply because this almost looks like a doorway going outside of a room you might be standing in. But for our purposes, it's just a pattern. Again, don't be fooled by how quickly I draw this. It may be necessary for accuracy or precision for you to slow down so that it doesn't end up being sloppy. It's one thing to understand how the pattern works, but one of my favorite sayings, especially on this particular assignment, is practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. And if you do something incorrectly for any length of time, you will get very good at doing it wrong. I'm sure there is some philosophical point, but at this point I just want you to understand that as you practice your patterns over and over and over again, if you get sloppy with it, you're going to understand how the pattern works, but you're going to fall far short of perfect if your lines are sloppy. You can see how this pattern could just go on and on and on just by extending it out like that. But we're going to stop here on this one and do the next one. For the next one, however, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to take an area of the paper and we're going to do twice as many lines. And I'm actually going to start right under the word craftsmanship here and cut these lines in half. I'm also tracing over the existing blue lines so that I can make it very dark. So I'm cutting it in half horizontally and vertically. And I'm going to do one more over here because I like this pattern a lot too. On this pattern, we're going to put some diamond shapes on every corner. And here's where the grid really helps out. You can make them about the same size because you can eyeball where the height was where you're starting and also the width. You can also continue the pattern right off the edge here. So the diamond becomes a triangle and a right triangle down here. The way we're going to hide when it goes through here in the center is we're going to do horizontal and vertical lines, cross-hatching pattern. And that makes these diamonds look to be very dark. And once again, the reason we do this is because when these are coloring book pages, if you have a solid shape that's filled in, you can't color on top of this, or you can, but the color won't show up. It'd be a waste of a crayon or colored pencil. So for our purposes, instead of coloring things in solid, as is the normal way of doing patterns, we're just going to crosshatch them. One of the things that you might be experiencing as you do this is you might, once you really get into it and you start focusing and concentrating, you might come to understand that you're in sort of a meditative state, which means as you're doing your lines, the more that you do them and the more that you concentrate, you can actually cause your mind to start thinking about other things. A lot of people do this particular kind of art, and for that matter, art in general, for that meditative state. It's very common to hear artists talk about this. I think the word in Japanese is satori, if I'm not mistaken. It's a meditative state where you kind of lose track of time, which is why I always have a timer similar to this one when we're in class, because it's very easy. In fact, I forgot to set the timer today during one of my classes, and the bell rang, and we weren't ready. We weren't cleaned up and ready to go to our next class. So, again, I'm doing vertical lines, hatch marks, and in order to get rid of the line down the middle, excuse me, I'm also going to do horizontal. Please keep in mind that, especially on sheets like this is a practice sheet, but as I mentioned a moment ago, practice makes permanent. You're going to make mistakes on here, and that's okay. One of the biggest rules I have in my classroom is no erasing. And of course, I'm drawing with a pen, which not every student wants to do or can do. And I don't have enough pens to give everyone or to loan everybody a pen to do this. But the beauty of doing patterns with the ballpoint pen is that you can't erase. So I want students, I still hear erasing going on in class, and I have to look up every so often and say, okay, no erasing, please don't do it. I want to see your mistakes. And I've made some mistakes. In fact, I made some mistakes today. A lot of the mistakes I made were when I would look up to correct a student's work or to correct a student's behavior, and when I looked back down, I sort of lost track of where I was drawing, and I made a couple of mistakes. But one of the cool things about teaching like this is if I make a mistake, I always point it out. So one of the mistakes I made today was on this pattern, where I did this part of it, and we'll do this pattern in a couple of minutes, and I accidentally started putting hatch marks on the wrong part of the drawing. And that's okay, that was a mistake. Not the end of the world. You're going to make mistakes, and that's perfectly fine. So to finish up this pattern, I'm going to put a circle in the middle. And on the circles in the middle, I'm only going to do hatch marks going this way, so that they look like they're a different tone or shade than the ones in the middle, the diamond shapes. Here's where the consistency comes in. As much as possible, you want these circles to be the same size. At the moment, I'm not super concerned with the fact that they're going to look like different shades. You can see some of the lines are further apart. At this point, we're just worried about the process. When we start adding these patterns to our final, we will be very much more concerned with keeping the lines consistent. Even the hatch marks that are inside different shapes, we want them to be consistently about the same tone, because that's what patterns are all about. They're about repetition. So the next pattern we're going to do, you may have already seen it on one of the other ones, one of the other samples that I did. We're going to draw a square down here, 2 by 2 square. And on this pattern, this is kind of tricky. I'm going to put a little tick mark at the halfway point. Then I'm going to start at this corner and draw a triangle going to that halfway mark. I'm going to hit this point, but I'm imagining an area on this line that's about halfway in that area, which is going to be right about there. And then I'm going to do a triangle going to the other corner like this. Then I'm going to repeat that process. About halfway here is this one. Halfway on this one is about right here. And then I'm going to keep repeating this. So I'm going to start about here and go to this one. Halfway in here is right about, let's see, let's go a quarter into this one instead, just to keep them about the same size. They're getting slightly smaller as you go. And from here you can sort of eyeball it. They're still all triangles, but they're going to get a little bit smaller in size as we go down and in. Still going to the corners as much as possible. So we end up with an area that almost looks like a tunnel or a pit. So here's a math term for you. The hypotenuse of a triangle is the longest line on a triangle. So for instance, if this is a triangle, if my hand is a triangle, the hypotenuse is this one. The piece that comes in, it's on the other side of the right angle. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some very long lines parallel to the hypotenuse. And what that does is it exaggerates the feeling that this shape and these shapes inside the shape are going into a tunnel or a pit. The cool thing about this particular pattern is that this can be done inside any blank area on your drawing. And what I'm trying to convince students to do is to do patterns in all of the blank spots of their sketchbooks. So for instance, I have some blank spots in my sketchbook. There's a blank spot right there. A lot of these pages have blank areas, and so I'm trying to encourage students to practice these patterns. Now it's going to start breaking down a little bit, because if I did it parallel to here, it would be really close to that one. So I'm going to change this one up by doing lines like this. And then since these ones are parallel to that hypotenuse, I'm going to do some lines like this. As much as possible, you don't want the pattern inside each one of these triangles to be the same. So I'm going to keep doing 90-degree changes from the previous one and see if it continues to make sense as we go closer to the center of the drawing. As much as possible, we want some distinction or some differentiation between the lines in here. So we're going to go 90 degrees from the ones on either side of it, as long as we're able to, before it stops making sense. Instead of going straight up and down, I'm going to do a slight angle going this way, even though it's not technically touching that one. Horizontal here, diagonal here, angled this way on this one. And now we're getting so small that it might not make sense to try and do some inside here, but I'm going to do two going this way and leave it at that. So you can kind of get a sense that it spirals around down into what looks like a tunnel or a cave. And again, this can be done anywhere, in any random shape you have. And I'll show you later on, as we fill up the page with these shapes, what that looks like. This next pattern starts with an S shape. So I'm going to start again right up here underneath the word craftsmanship and do a backwards S. And I've taken up 4 squares, or almost 4 squares. The next line is a mirror image of that one. And then the next line is a mirror image of that one. Since I have some space over here, I'm going to go ahead and do another one and continue the pattern as it goes into the open squares next to it. Now the trick on this pattern is that every other line, every other space, you're going to alternate curved lines like this. So since that one goes up, the one next to it's going to go down. So this one's going to go down here. And what you can do is you can either do individual lines like this, but once you get into a groove, you can actually continue to draw without lifting up your pencil or pen. So I'm going to actually follow along this line, draw up here, go down there, and then back up to here. And the cool thing about this way of doing it is that as I draw over and over on the edges, it's going to create a darker, thicker line in between, and it'll kind of give an optical illusion that these lines are curved around something. And you'll see that in just a minute as soon as I get further down. So I prefer to draw along the edge of the contour, which is here, and keep my pen on the paper or my pencil on the paper as I go up and do more curves. And then when you have extra space up here at the top, just do more lines. Do the same thing going in the other direction. After a while, you'll get into a groove with this. And even though my lines aren't perfectly identical in height and width, this is where the fun from my perspective comes in. Because you can really play with it and really get into a groove of concentration. And in fact, I have read somewhere that this is a technique that specialists will use to help patients that have ADHD. It takes extra focus, and it might frustrate you, but if you can focus on every line and every shape and really dig down into your mind, this can have a very much of a calming influence on your thinking and slow your mind down. Just one of many ways that art is beneficial that way. And since I sometimes have a problem concentrating on things with everything I got going on in my life, one of the benefits for me in teaching this 5 times a day is that I get to do these same patterns as the students are. And I've heard some of the students say, goodness, if I had to do that 5 times a day, I'd probably go crazy. But the truth is, it's, again, very meditative, very contemplative. In fact, on occasion, I have to make sure that I'm not focusing more on my art and less on students that might need help with theirs. So that's what that pattern looks like. And again, you can see because I doubled up when I was drawing it, it has this flowing like it's going over and around these shapes. And the dark line that's caused in the middle from going over it a couple of times gives it some depth. So the next pattern that I really like to do, one that I really hadn't done much before, you can do any shape. I like starting with a rectangle or with a square. This particular one could be done anywhere or any way in any blank space, and I'll show you how that works in just a minute. But I'm just going to do a series of half circles all the way around the inside of this frame. And this is another one that has kind of an optical illusion to it once you finish, because we're going to continue these shapes all the way around the inside, and then as if it were scales on a fish or a lizard, we're going to start at the center of the top of one of these and continue that process in that pattern all the way around. Now if I wanted to try and go halfway in this one, I could fit it in there, but it's going to start getting tight in the corners very quickly. You can either do smaller ones, or you can skip it all together, and you'll see it in a minute when it happens. So there's sort of a partial scale on this one. On this one, I'm not going to go here, but I'm going to go here. But I can also put another one there. Feel free to alter these as you go, but please make an attempt to do them the way I'm teaching them, so that I can see that you understand the process and that you're paying attention in class and following my instructions, following my directions. So you're more than welcome to embellish these. Excuse me. But for the most part, try and do them exactly as I do them, or at least very close. You can see that I'm skipping over some of these as it gets tighter on the corners. But it's still going halfway to the top or bottom of the curve on each scale. So even though I'm skipping on occasion, especially on the corner ones, you can always go back in later and add a little piece like that. As it gets more towards the middle, it starts to get tiny, because the area that I'm drawing into is tighter and tighter. So anything that doesn't look right, if you want to, you can go back in and spot and maybe do another scale in there. Now here's what I meant a minute ago when I said patterns like this can be done in areas like this. It's going to look weird when I hit this side over here. So I'm going to actually start and go in the opposite direction here around the outside of this one. It's interesting because this almost looks like an intestine. So I'm just filling in areas as I go around. And this is how you can use up the blank space inside your drawing, or white space inside your drawing. And you can go either direction, clockwise, counterclockwise, whatever works for you. For me, this is part of the visual fun. You can sort of start playing little games as you mix up the patterns a little bit. And I think it keeps it interesting. So that's how you would fill up a space that's between other areas. I could continue up here, but I want to leave that alone for now. Another very fun pattern, and I'm not going to draw the extra grids, but I'm imagining a grid in here that starts with a bunch of horizontal lines. I'm just going to do 4 and 4 and alternate horizontal and vertical. This is a pattern that you will see a lot in the shadows of comic books, at least the comic books that I used to read. I'm not sure if they still do it. And if you need the space, or if it doesn't work out perfectly, it doesn't have to be exactly 4 lines either. You can see I've already gone up to 5 in some of these. I've also seen artists do this type of pattern at angles, so that they almost look triangular when you look at certain areas of the shadows, for instance. Last pattern we're going to do today on this particular video, because it's getting to be pretty lengthy. We've done all of these patterns in class this week, but the last one I'm going to do on this sheet, on my practice sheet, I'm going to go ahead and start with another square. And this time, inside each of these two, I'm going to do a long, skinny flame shape. These two flame shapes happen to be a mirror image of each other, but you can do them as a pattern the same way also. And then I'm going to come from the top and do another flame like this. Then I'm going to go inside these so that it really looks like a flame, or maybe a curved zebra pattern. And since it's a pattern, I already know what's going to go up here. There's going to be another shape there, and another shape over here. So the next thing we want to do on this one is around the flames, we're going to do a series of horizontal hash marks. And again, trying to be very careful to start and stop on the line. It's not going to be perfect, but for the most part, try and focus on hitting the line. And then we're not just going to go around it, but we're also going to do the flame part in the middle. So I'm being very careful here, because it gets really thin right here. We're going to go all the way around the flames, and shorter lines are a lot easier to do than longer lines. Earlier in the semester I showed students how to draw a straight line without a ruler, and it's all about sighting. When you put your pencil down or your pen down, you put your pencil, if I wanted to do a straight line from here to there, I would put my pencil here, and then I would put my eye there and draw the line as quickly as possible to that other point. And you kind of saw it when we did this one. Just like throwing a baseball, you don't watch the ball, you don't watch your hand. You focus your eye on where you're throwing it. So you can see as I go more quickly, I'll zoom in a bit. I've already started making a few mistakes here because I'm going very quickly. When that happens, just slow down a bit and concentrate. And since this is a pen, you can already see where the pen's getting gunked up, which is what that is right there. That's excess ink that came out of the pen as I was drawing. Sorry for that. I'm in a classroom where the lights are on a timer. So if you sit still long enough, the lights go out right in the middle of the video. If I had a studio, that probably wouldn't happen. So now I'm going on the inside of the flame so that it goes every other line has a shape, or every other shape has hatch marks in it, which again gives it the effect of looking like zebra stripes. And for that matter, these shapes can be different as well. These could be more angular looking shapes. Two of the ways that we think about patterns are the ones that are very angular are considered geometric shapes, whereas the ones that are more curved are more organic. So that's what the sheet looks like. This is how many patterns we did in the last 2 days at school. I walked students through them as we went through, and I think I have time for one more. This one is also a very fun pattern, but it can be tedious. I'm going to take up 6, 3 this way and 2 this way. But this time I'm going to go and make very shallow wave patterns. And I think I'm going to go one more so that it's 4 wide instead of 3. Now what I'm going to do is the point of each of these is going to be in the center of these. So I'm going to put a dot in the center here and also in the center of the ones down here, so that now I can go from here to here, from here to there, continue that pattern. Over here it's going to be half of one of those. Then again on the line. So what this makes it look like, it looks like the waves are alternating. This next part is the tricky part, and this is where a lot of students failed, which is why we're doing it on graph paper this time. What these lines consist of are vertical lines, and I'm going to start right below this point, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and I'm going to follow this shape, the contour of this shape, drawing vertical lines to the bottom of the next wave. You can also start down here and go up. And I want to leave a space, let me zoom in. I want to leave a space at the top, except for where I messed up right there, so that when you finish this, it looks like waves. It looks like there's a white line here. Your eye is fooling yourself. There is no solid line there, but because these are so dense or so close together, it looks like water on the ocean. And so again, I'm just following along, starting at this wave and going up and just almost touching the one above it. It was at this point, as we continued to do these lines, that I started hearing a lot of complaints in the classroom. I have a few autistic students that come in, and I kept hearing, "Are we done yet? Why are we drawing so many lines?" It was kind of funny. I love having those students in my classroom. They do this very well because some of them have super focus. But even while they're having super focus, some of them will complain about having to do it, and yet their artwork is brilliant. Very nicely done. They have a focus and concentration, but unlike my other students, a lot of students that are my standard students or non-special ed students, even in some of my classes today, a hush falls over the classroom, which just means that kids are completely concentrating. And they're so focused on doing repetitive work like this that they're getting into that meditative state that I mentioned earlier. And it's so funny because every so often someone will quote unquote wake up and go, "Why is it so quiet in here?" Those are wonderful times. Sometimes I actually play music on one of the YouTube channels so that there can be something happening in the background, because this kind of work is extremely repetitive. But as I've said, I've already, even just demonstrating this just now, I've already reached that flow state of so concentrating on what's directly in front of me and focusing on each line, trying to keep them parallel, trying to keep them precise and consistent. The spacing in between is consistent for the most part. And again, I'm not looking for perfection. One of my favorite quotes that everyone gets wrong, at least as far as art goes, is practice makes permanent. Practice does not make perfect. Because as I've already seen, I've got a lot of students prior to using the grid paper who just did a bunch of marks on the paper and they were in the same direction, and some of them were even equally spaced, but they were super sloppy in trying to hit the marks to start on the line and end on the line, that it got to be kind of ridiculous. So for now, that's what your finished page should look like. There's still actually some room up here where I took notes that I could do some more lines. You could just continue the pattern around, or you could start a new pattern. There's a really fun one that I'll demonstrate very quickly because it's one of my favorite ones, and I'm going to zoom way into this area so you can see what I'm talking about. This one is very simply the repetition of what looks like a flame. So if you imagine this is a candle flame, but instead of being a candle flame, it's actually leaves on a vine. And the cool thing about it is you can start with the leaf randomly, or you can start with the stem. And starting with the stem, you can just sort of do it around and around. And this is actually my preferred way of doing it. I prefer to do the stem all the way around so that I know where it's going. But this is how you can fill up areas of your sketchbook and of your drawing page with patterns. And that one was kind of sloppy. So I've got entire pages of just this pattern because, as I said, it's one of my favorites. Let's see if I have one close by. One of my sketchbooks. You can see it on the corner over here, or on the middle of the page there. So those are patterns that we've drawn in class so far. The nice thing about this particular vine one is you can start on a leaf and just continue all the way around to fill up an area with shapes. And even though they're all flame shapes, as I mentioned from the start, because it's on a vine, they are now leaves. And speaking of leaves, now's a good time to leave. Thanks for watching.